This week, Emmet talks with Dr. Matt Finch, a strategy and foresight practitioner, about how recent comics and the MCU movies have repositioned Tony Stark as a futurist billionaire in the mold of Elon Musk. They talk about the limits of the Tony Stark character, how race has been portrayed in Iron Man comics and why, how the Warren Ellis extremist storyline from 15 years ago showed the changing priorities of Iron Man storytelling in the era of the War on Terror, and more. But first, if you're enjoying this podcast, support the show at patreon.com/deconcomics for as little as $2 a month. My brother Paul and I, hosts of To the Batpoles podcast, have been doing bi-weekly videos available to all patrons of TV trivia from the late 20th century. More perks and bonus content at higher donation levels, including our ongoing full-length podcast on 1960s Spider-Man comics. Pledge your support now at patreon.com/deconcomics.
This is Emmet.
This is Matt.
And this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Emmet in Country Victoria. I'm on the line with an old friend of mine, Dr. Matt Finch, who is a writer, strategy and foresight practitioner. And we know ourselves principally through nerd circles, though. I think that's fair to say, right?
Absolutely. I remember some very intense conversations about the comic book world in the inner western suburbs of Sydney almost a decade ago now.
Almost a decade ago. I know. Incredible. So Dr. Matt and I are old friends, and we got talking recently about Iron Man, and particularly attempts by relatively recent writers to reposition Iron Man as what they call a futurist. And I was quite struck by that because I've started reading some older Iron Man runs, and it occurred to me that the version of Iron Man that people are very familiar with is this more contemporary spin on the character, but also the movie version of him, who has been frequently compared to characters like Mr. Elon Musk. And I started to wonder, what's the danger of a billionaire being seen as a superhero, and in an entirely uncritical way? What does that mean? I was further inspired by I came across an interview with director Adam McKay in Jacobin magazine. I can't believe any other film director today would be interviewed by Jacobin magazine, but this bit jumped out at me. So this is the journalist talking to Adam McKay, and he's talking about how McKay was trying to get a adaptation of The Boys, Garth Ennis and Derek Robinson's The Boys, off the ground and didn't go anywhere. So here's the section. The Boys is the total antithesis of the Avengers and its celebration of libertarian billionaires thumbing their nose at democracy. And this is McKay. The famous line where Tony Stark lands and he's like, what did he say? The US military is privatized. McKay says, wincing, the dangers of an arrogant, unaccountable elite with blood in their hands flying around the world. For McKay, they might as well be hedge fund managers on coke. He got a proof of concept trailer for The Boys and shopped around town, but nobody would bite. What's interesting about that little exchange between the interviewer and McKay is that McKay immediately zeroes in on the political context of Iron Man, of this notion of extreme wealth and super illegal action of the superhero. And what I am concerned about, where you've got the likes of, say, Warren Ellis and Eddie Granov's run on Extremis, Mac Fraction and Salvador Lorca's run on, I think it was the Invincible Iron Man, where we meet this version of Iron Man as a futurist, is they seem to be trying to dislodge Iron Man, the character, from his original problematic roots, which is that he's an arms dealer. In the Vietnam War, he creates a suit of armor to escape imprisonment, and then he decides to no longer make arms, but he's now a superhero who's still battling and waging war, just in different terms. And he's very much a capitalist. and he's very much a cold warrior as well. Like a lot of his villains were Soviet Iron Men, if you like. So these writers who came up in the early 21st century, they seem to be trying to divorce Iron Man from that era. So their solution was he's a futurist. And I thought I would talk to Dr. Matt because you, Matt, are interested in future strategies, and maybe you'd have some insights into this. Also, you like comics, so bonus.
It works out pretty well. I have to say, preparing for this conversation with you, it was like some kind of hero's journey of almost being destroyed by reading too many comics, reading some really bad comics, but then also finding unexpected sort of branches off of this key topic that actually sort of redeemed things for me, particularly work by Dwayne McDuffie, which we might get to later. But I really feel like in the intense period leading up to this conversation, I saw kind of the best and worst of what that kind of mainstream big two American comics can offer. So a really interesting character to look at these questions through.
Yeah. I did find at least one comic book journalist who discussed the notion of Iron Man as a futurist with reference to futurism, the fascist movement, and said, hey, why did they choose this term? Why do they, are they not aware of this? And I thought at least someone out there picked up on that. But there is this idea of Iron Man as suddenly a political figure. Or rather, if you look at Extremists, where you have the John Pilger character more or less get undermined by Tony Stark, it seems as if Warren Ellis is trying to argue in that issue that, look, ideals and principles and critical understanding of politics is all well and good, but at the end of the day, you need to get in bed with power. You need to just let the powerful men do what they're going to do. Let the Tony Starks, let the billionaires reshape democracy, reshape society as they see fit, because they know better. They're billionaires, and which is a sort of assumption about the way society works that I think is increasingly common now. The idea of the benevolent billionaire. And we still have yet to see any evidence that this is a thing. So
I think that when you talk about that idea of it somehow being depoliticized, I wonder if actually this idea of reimagining the character as a futurist is partly because of the way in which sort of telecommunications technologies sort of become more and more present in our everyday lives, and the perception people have that actually we have almost science fictional technologies in our pockets now, that this Extremist, the comic you're talking about, it has a smartphone in it, but it's actually made just before the iPhone arrives. Like when they show Stark has the greatest smartphone in the world, the Stark 99, and it looks like an incredibly crude sort of early 2000s smartphone now to our eyes, sort of 20 years later or 12 years later. But I don't know if the change is that dramatic in terms of querying the notion of him being a billionaire. I recall the fact, when the character was created, Stan Lee said, I tried to make this kind of unlikable guy, like who's the most unsexy possible superhero in the late 60s when, all the counterculture were embracing things like Spider-Man and the kind of kookiness and freakiness of those characters. I wonder if I can make an arms dealer look like a hero. And then the two things are like, how vulnerable can I make him? Like give him this injury that requires the suit, and how much can I turn him away from the path of being an arms manufacturer? And even in Extremists, which is very quite sort of pro being aggression and pro military, there is still this sort of discussion of like, I don't supply the military, but we do design for SHIELD. And now that we're in the phone business, we really don't need to make weapons anymore. The problem I have is actually the fact that I feel like the storytelling always returns to the same sort of grab bag of issues, that there's only so much you can do with that character. And what I found reading so many of these comics in the run up to this chat is the extent to which, there are only so many beans in that tin for you to rattle. And at some point I was like, oh, he's turned into an AI again. He's gone to space again. He's shaved off his beard as a disguise again. Like that happens in both Matt Fraction's and Kieran Gillen's run, I think within almost like a year of each other. Like there are two stories where his great disguise is to shave off his goatee. And And to what extent was it an attempt to reinvigorate something? You know, like really, we've told every story we can with this industrialist hero, and then Extremist comes along as a kind of post 9/11 James Bond movie, like really selling this as an action movie, a Hollywood movie, a movie that speaks to America's sense of like, we've got to go to the extremes to combat this new threat. And I mean, he's even drawn like Tom Cruise in that comic book. So it feels like a sort of attempt to reshape that character so it continues to be relevant and continues to shift product, I guess, in the 21st century.
But also, I mean, it's that same idea that sort of internet utopianism that we came up with as, people of a similar age in the turn of the last century, where there was this notion of, we've gone beyond politics. That's what I kind of mean about depoliticized. There was this sense that once information is free, we'll be able to sustain ourselves, productively. We'll have access to all this information. We'll be able to do all these things. We'll be creative workers all of a sudden. And that was a bill of goods that was sold to us. Meanwhile, all our information was being collected, money was being made, profits were being earned, and we discovered new forms of warfare were being developed in the cyberspace. And what I thought was interesting was Iron Man was exactly the kind of comic, and I think at the time we assumed Warren Ellis was exactly the kind of writer who would talk about that. And instead, he seemed to be trying to recreate, again, recycling his idea of, let's take a post-Watchmen look at the superhero and the grim and gritty reality of violence. Let's really shock you with violence. Not the interesting applications of a billionaire technocrat industrialist trying to wage new forms of war in the 21st century. That largely went unexplored. I was quite bothered by that, and also the fact that that's a new ideological space, and that's kind of what I mean by depoliticized. It didn't allow for the other point of view. That's what you need for a political discussion. You need the 2 points of view. And as much as I have issues with Mr. Stan Lee, as listeners to this podcast will now be aware, he was somebody who aimed for the center. He wasn't a radical by any means. He wasn't a progressive by any means. But he acknowledged that there were two sides. And Iron Man was his attempt, as you say, to try and introduce somebody who was politically toxic to the comic book readership, and then try and have a dialogue around that. Now, you may question his methods and his motives and what was going on there, and when he was trying to teach the kids a lesson, what was his thinking behind taking an arms dealer and creating him into a superhero arms dealer? But at least he was acknowledging the two sides. In Extremis, we meet this character who is basically John Pilger. He's dismissed. He's thrown out, and that's because John Pilger is, in actual life, a excellent journalist who holds power to account. And the point of his appearance in the comic seems to be, well, you're wasting time. You're just creating a fuss. And I had the opportunity to interview John Pilger, and I mentioned to him that he was in a comic book, and he was not impressed. Particularly, his character gets dismissed. But you did a lot of reading on this. I wound up doing a lot of reading on sort of 80s era Iron Man. So I think we'll, in the course of our conversation, touch on all these guys. But how do you think other writers tackled the futurism idea where Tony Stark is concerned? Because you mentioned Kieran Gillen, Matt Fraction, Mark Miller in Civil War. It's more or less like Tony's a human computer almost.
Well, I think one of the challenges, and this is inevitable, right? It's like Frank Miller saying there are 40 equally valid ways to write Batman or whatever. Is you end up with a mishmash of ideas that, like I guess a practicing foresight or futures person would say, well, that's gone a bit adrift from what it really might mean in the real world. Like in the same way that different words get bandied around at different times in pop culture, like the era where everything's about chaos theory, the era where everything's quantum. So there is a whole mishmash of ideas about, like, is Stark the test pilot of the future? Does he have some privileged access to tomorrow? In Civil War II, which is really about, like arresting people for crimes because they've happened, and is it possible to sort of be aware of something and be proactive before the event has been committed? He's actually the guy who's against that. He's against predictive algorithms. In the poster, Captain Marvel's slogan is change the future, and his slogan is protect the future. I suppose what gets interesting for me is Eve Ewing, who we might speak about later, who had a run on Ironheart, the spin-off with an African-American woman in a suit being a superhero like Iron Man. She talked about superheroes serving as a kind of shared cultural mirror, paragons of what bravery is, she says. And I suppose we move into this world where like information systems are omnipresent. The density and liquidity of information technology, like the number of things you can do in a single device and how easy it is to make information flow from device to device is so notable now. And you even see that in the metaphor, right, of like whether Iron Man has this flowing liquid metal suit, whether the suit is in some way part of his body. I suppose it's more like in that moment of change, if the superhero is a mirror, who gets to be the protagonist, and what does heroism look like in this era? And on one hand, you have something like, hey, it's a billionaire white tech industrialist in a suit who always has that thread of being problematic, right? From Stan Lee going onward, even in the Marvel movies, like Robert Downey Jr.'s Tony Stark causes as much harm as good from time to time. Like Stark is always almost a supervillain.
I mean, it's usually framed from the point of view of a character quirk in order to make him relatable. So there's this notion, particularly in the movies, there's this sense of his ego is getting in the way, but he's essentially noble. Whereas I think it's more interesting to explore what if he's entirely wrong? Like, what if he's just wrong? And some writers have done that, and unfortunately, some of them have gone too far. Like you had the famous Avengers storyline, The Crossing, where he's evil. All of a sudden, he becomes evil. But yeah, this notion of him essentially being somebody with good intentions, trying to do the right thing, is interesting sometimes. But I'm really interested in the notion of what if Tony Stark is the problem, and what if the likes of Riri Williams are the solution? People who take the dinosaur of Stark and then evolve and go forward, and he has to take a step back. I'm interested in that move, and unfortunately, I think there's a lot of fan hostility to Riri Williams, I've noticed, and I was quite charmed by. I know Bendis is Brian Michael Bendis wrote the initial Ironheart storyline, but I know he possibly wasn't the best choice, but there was a lot of interesting possibilities around the character, and I think Eve Ewing took the ball and ran with it and went all the way to Wakanda immediately, I think, which is, of course, if you're a person of color and you're writing Marvel, Wakanda is just this spectacular opportunity, But yeah, I apologize. I cut your call. I think the idea of Tony Stark as a flawed person, we know he's an alcoholic. We know he's a capitalist. We know he's a businessman. We know he's a former death dealer and he feels regrets about it. But sometimes I feel as if all those interesting avenues tend to get just ticked off. And then we just have typical superhero shenanigans with a frisson of, wounded male vulnerability underneath the surface.
But that's the thing I'm wondering as you say that. I mean, to what extent, like a great villain, you can usually partly see their point of view, right? And even the second Avengers film, I mean, essentially, you end up with this kind of evil robot army because of his good intentions. I think in some ways, the character is so close to villainy, and increasingly they play with that. Like the number of times where he's the cause of the problem, this recent crossover event, Empire, where he really sort of cajoles his superhero colleagues into defending a bunch of people who turn out to be baddies. the Axis series, where people sort of flip between good and bad, and he basically gets all of San Francisco hooked on subscription superpowers. I think that's basically how it works, isn't it? It's like the age of subscription digital platforms. I think what was interesting to me is you sort of run this character largely dry. The movies reinvigorate it in some ways, partly just because of Robert Downey Jr.'s performance and his own personal history and his vulnerability. Like, that character has been the sort of foundation of this whole movie universe. In a weird way, the fact that actors are going to age and retire and the characters are going to be killed off creates more of an opportunity for change. I'm almost more excited for the Ironheart TV show than the comics, because I feel in the comics, in the end, of course, it goes back to the same old narrative of Stark. Like,
yeah. But I mean, I don't know if did you notice there was a movie fan campaign this month to bring Tony Stark back from the dead. They had a really badly phrased hashtag. I think it was something like "Make Tony Stark alive again" or something like that. Lives again, I think it was. Anyway, people can look it up. It shouldn't take too long. But yeah, they refuse to let go, because now we have a problem where actors will now spend the rest of their careers having to answer questions about being Iron Man, about being Captain America, and the filmmakers have tried to move events forward to the next generation so you can have younger actors and younger story concepts. But within our lifetime, we're going to see a new Iron Man. It's going to be Tony Stark again. There'll be a reboot. There'll be some sort of, they'll bring it off around full circle again. So inevitably, the movies will become like the comics, where you've got concepts that last for decades upon decades that just keep cycling back.
Well, that's the question, though, isn't it? It's like whether it'll be interesting to see what happens with live action, of whether we do have, successive generations. If we have, like son of this generation of characters, daughter of this generation of characters, if things move on, because, this is what I was thinking about Ironheart, is she has Stark as a kind of AI voice in her helmet.
Yeah.
And then the Stark AI ends up, he ends up going off and protagonizing again. Like, he goes off and, while the body is being reanimated, I'm like, right. So we demoted him to the voice in her ear, which is at least a step in the right direction. And now he's back. He's back as a digital ghost. Like, the inertia, the momentum of, like, seriously, it's the same interchangeable white guy protagonist, strikes me as one of the enormous challenges that, even though right now there are so many heartening examples of, like, different writers, different characters being represented. I think Eve Ewing, who was, really harassed on the internet for taking over that Ironheart comic, she was like the 5th Black woman writer in 80 years of Marvel history, right? So what changes and whether those changes stick, I think it's a really crucial moment for that. When I was reading this, I was reminded of Dwayne McDuffie's work. Dwayne McDuffie's Deathlock is a more interesting Iron Man than Iron Man, right? Like a African-American software engineer who ends up fused into this military robot. That was the comic that brought me back. After reading all these comics to get ready for this conversation, discovering McDuffie's Deathlock was like, this is what I needed. This is what the fusion of a human and machine in this military corporate context is.
Yeah.
I think McDuffie explored really interesting points.
And then you're absolutely right, because he consciously did it again with Hardware, which is his milestone book, which they're now reprinting. You can now get the collected editions of Hardware, but that's about a talented young Black man who's exploited by a billionaire, a white billionaire, and then is framed by his mentor, would-be white savior, and becomes Hardware to defend himself, because he understands how the corporate world works, and he understands the backbiting that's already built into this, and he understands that he's basically been bought and sold. So he becomes a superhero to survive as a Black man in corporate America, which is an amazing premise.
Well, I think the genius of what McDuffie does with Hardware is he basically splits the Iron Man character into two. That the billionaire the billionaire still funds and bankrolls the technology because he doesn't know that Kurt is like secretly working in the basement, like trying to bring him down. But the inventor hero and the billionaire sponsor are kind of split into two, and one of them is the light side and one of them is the evil side or the malicious side. So I think McDuffie finally got to write Iron Man the way he might have wanted to before, and I think we both read McDuffie's sort of 2 Iron Man issues from the 80s, I think, where Rhodey is really the hero. Like Rhodes is an incredibly brave and heroic character, and Tony Stark ends up in just his underwear. It's an absolutely brilliant sort of takedown or satire of that character.
Yeah, and as Denny O'Neil was the one who really sort of got the ball rolling with Rhodes in terms of making him Iron Man and exploring the idea of there being a handover, which again, the tragedy of that is that Rhodey is a really interesting character, and in the classic Iron Man run, he's initially introduced, I think, as like an odd job man for Stark, and then he just takes on more and more responsibilities, and he becomes a confidant, and then he becomes a superhero in his own right. And if you continue following the fictional history of Rhodey, when you get to The Crew by Priest, The Crew is amazing, because in The Crew he's just got a part of the Iron Man outfit, and he's now he's trying to do street level superheroing, and it comes really interesting. The Crew is a great book. But yeah, that storyline you sent, you nominated for us to look at, that was really interesting, just seeing McDuffie just bleeding into this very white comic. People of color, characters of color, they're just in the mix, and he's just introducing them as characters within the story, and some are good, some are evil, but they're just in the story, and you suddenly realize just how white Iron Man is. A lot of the comics were. And I when I was reading Iron Wars, I was really taken with the character of Macy Pearson, who was a black woman, a woman of color, who becomes a PR executive within Stark's corporation. And I did a little reading on her because, she's interesting, because she's quite driven. She's not in on the secret. She doesn't know Tony Stark is Iron Man. She's in a relationship with Rhodey. He's upset that he's now caught between Stark and Macy. He wants to be in this relationship, but he's not going to betray his friend and employer. And I read up on Macy. What happened to Macy? I don't recall this. I don't remember her from when I was reading Iron Man books as a kid. And the upshot of it is she is so professionally driven, she becomes a villain. So the premise is successful black woman reaches the top of Stark Industries, and she doesn't like the way Tony's running the company, so she basically tries to oust him. I think she tries to blackmail him, but that makes her a villain within the comic. And it's so disappointing to read that, because she seems like a really interesting character, but she's a threat to Tony, and she's a threat to Tony's corporate manliness. So you have to get rid of her. I feel as if there was an allergic reaction to this character within the writer pool. It wasn't David Michelinie and Bob Layton who wrote that ignoble end for Macy Pearson, but I was quite disappointed with that. And I think you mentioned Rhodey and you mentioned Joy McDuffie's. I think just that reflecting on, as you said before, Tony Stark as a white savior, the billionaire white savior. That just, how do white characters like Tony get to say what the future is? I guess that's where I'm going down on. It's like, why do they get to dictate the future? Why isn't it the Riri Williams or the Macy Pearsons or Rhodes who get to dictate the future or get to inform the future?
And that becomes about a question of what publishers and media companies perceive at a given moment is going to sell comics, sell cinema tickets and things. One of the interesting things about this character as Futurist is, future isn't just about technological change, it's about social change. And in many ways, the changes in values are more interesting and more significant than like how good the tech is. And even I was reflecting on this, the ways in which the sort of feminism and gay liberation movements of the 60s changed our notion of romance and intimacy in ways that spilled into sort of mainstream kind of cis-het notions of marriage. Like our whole notion of what it means to be in a relationship and to even think about issues like sexual pleasure was so shaped by other movements that's nothing to do with the technological progress that we've made in those 56 years, or it's entwined, but in complex ways. And one of the things that becomes sort of, it's the limit maybe of looking at this character in this way of, wow, someone flies around in a super amazing suit, is actually the future is not really about how fast you can go or how much information you can process. It's about these questions of justice and these different values. And I think it's also worthwhile us reflecting on our identities of, we've come to the point that we're having this conversation in a podcast, like what has been happening around us that, two white guys sort of at our age and our time of life are seeing things through this frame and maybe finally starting to question those issues of power and privilege and even like what we're bringing to this discussion. Like what are the limits of us trying to make a reading of this character in this way? Like it's really being confronted with your own whiteness and how harmful and how boring that can be, in all honesty. I mean, maybe that's the advantage of being forced to look at Tony Stark as this unpleasant mirror to people like you and me, as well as this hero turned villain.
Typically, where I tend to land on that question, like when I'm reflecting on my own privilege and the fact that the media I consumed from a very young age was extremely white, is to try and point to or advocate for media made by people of color, made about people of color, by people of color. And that tends to be where I almost say, well, it's now time for me to step aside and try and lift up other voices. And I think that's important. And that's where I think people who liked the character of Riri Williams were frustrated that it was Brian Michael Bendis who wrote Riri, because that would have been a huge opportunity for somebody. Now, Eve Ewing got that opportunity, but like, unfortunately, as you say, that attracted a lot of criticism. And I think that's where Marvel has a responsibility to protect their creators and actually stand by these decisions and stand by this vision of the future.
Coming up, how the futurist idea of Tony Stark excludes other people, what the extremist storyline of 2006 said about changing public anxieties during the War on Terror, the basic flaw of Tony Stark as a sympathetic character, and more. Don't forget you can help to unlock classic early episodes of Deconstructing Comics, help me return all the old episodes to this podcast feed, and at the $4 level, get access to hours of additional podcasts about MCU movies and the early Amazing Spider-Man issues by Lee and Ditko. At the $10 level, you can review the book of your choice with me on the podcast. Support this podcast and our other shows at patreon.com/deconcomics, or you can send a one-time donation via PayPal to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We appreciate your support.
Greetings from Wayne Manor Memoirs, a podcast dedicated to exploring the Batman mythos.
Each episode, we research a character, story, contributor, or piece of pop culture related or adjacent to the Dark Knight,
and try to understand why these topics are important to the Bat mythos. I'm Joe.
I'm Kendall, and some of our favorite topics include the transformation of Mr. Zero into Mr. Freeze,
the early appearances of the Riddler,
Booster Gold,
Commandi,
Jim Aparo,
and many, many more. Check out Wayne Manor Memoirs every other Friday, wherever you download your podcasts.
And follow us at Wayne Manor Memoirs on Facebook or at W Memoirs on Twitter.
Until next time, Bat Fanatics, be brave
and stay bold.
I'd like to introduce, I found a tweet from Space Twinks, the Twitter account at Space Twinks, Colin Space Twinks, who's a very interesting comics critic and writer, and I respect a lot of their thoughts on comics because they tend to be engaged in it very critically, and they tend to try and discuss on a deeper level beyond this sucks or I like this, like what's going on in the comics they're talking about. But they specifically discussed Iron Man at one point. The more you whittle down Iron Man to being about Tony Stark, rock star, cowboy, brilliant futurist, the less interesting the comics become. The best Iron Man stuff is all about internal and intrapersonal character drama, bouncing Tony off lots of other people who work with him. And in this case, I think of the Michelini-Leighton era because, yes, it's a soap opera with a large cast of character. I'd forgotten Miss Abrogast, who was in the books when I read them as a kid. Miss Abrogast was this character. But I'd completely forgotten. Pepper Potts has now sort of supplanted all the other women characters in Tony's life, and she's also the love interest. But there was an interesting group of people within the Iron Man books before, and I think the futurist tagline is also a way of excluding other people. It's about the brilliant individual. It's about a man who is so amazing, he can imagine and conceive of the future. And if it goes wrong, it's because the rest of the world just isn't as quick as he is, and they can't keep up with him. And that's where they're trying to introduce drama, because they've excluded other relationships within the title of Iron Man. And that's why I mentioned Empire to you as a potential book to, and I apologize because I don't think you enjoyed Empire, but that's spelled with a Y, folks. And that's a book which I personally had a lot of issues with because it took the ending of one of my favorite Avengers stories by Steve Englehart, where the Celestial Madonna storyline, where this vegetable people called the Kotati have the character of Mantis goes off with a reincarnated version of her dead lover who's now a plant person, and she goes off with him to the Kotati planet to raise their messiah. And it's kind of fairy tale ending. It's quite beautiful. And as you said before, in Empire, we learn that they're evil. They're on a genocidal quest to kill Earth and revenge themselves on, I think it was the Kree, I want to say. It was the Kree. Anyway, it's a whole thing. But one of the inciting incidents of this storyline is Tony Stark has these visions. And it turns out he's been drip-fed these visions by the Kotati. It's a trap. But at that point, I realized Tony Stark Futurist has gone from the Ellis sort of bleeding-edge futurist, he's got this understanding of science and technology that's so far ahead of his time, to he's literally having visions. He's literally just, it's become fantasy. It's the futurist as dreamer now. He's the dream weaver now.
Except, and this is where it gets so muddy, like when he has the visions, he says, I'm an engineer. I believe in what I can touch. I don't believe in destiny, do I? Like he has this little internal monologue. I think the really interesting thing about Empire, and it ties into what you were saying about the 80s run in Michelini, Empire is another example of Tony Stark getting it wrong. He tells everyone the plant people are good. In the second Avengers movie, he's the guy who basically creates the Ultron threat. Like he's reliably wrong. And one of the moments that's really interesting is in Armor Wars, which actually was probably the most enjoyable Iron Man comic I had to read for this thing.
I'm so glad you recommended it because I really enjoyed it. I thought Armor Wars is great. Carry on, sorry.
But Michelini says, up until they wrote that story, Iron Man was always reactive. Like he's always saving the world from a threat. And they created this story where he's proactive. It's partly to reduce the number of armored characters in the Marvel universe. And they say he's going to fight his allies. He's going to fight the government. He's going to be a different character at the end of this. And the moment when he fights Stingray, who's another good guy, and he beats him and then realizes, oh, this isn't actually my technology. I didn't need to fight him. It's like the beginning of the guy. This guy is always kind of wrong. Like he's pretty fallible. And I think that was really interesting that in this kind of 80s power-suited boardroom soap opera version of the character, which obviously suits the era of Dynasty and Dallas, their really interesting thing is this is a proactive hero, but his judgment is not actually sound necessarily.
And the premise of Armor Wars, is he's to track down all these other characters who are armored, as you say, and their armor is based on a stolen version of his technology. So he's tracking them all down and he's disabling the suits so they can't be used anymore. And Stingray, turns out, he was an Avenger and he works for the government. And I've always been fascinated by the look of Stingray. I never really read anything with him. I don't really know if he caught on, but he's a cool looking character. He goes under the sea. He looks amazing. Red and white suit. It's cool. But like when he realizes he's wrong, I had the thought, oh, this is a book all about corporate IP. This is like an aggressive defense of intellectual property. Tony Stark doesn't want anyone else, because there's this whole discussion with his lawyer about, well, you never patented your designs, so they're in the public domain. And he's like, oh, this is disgraceful. It's like a Disney executive. Oh, Mickey can't be in the public domain. We have to sue them all. Sue them all. That's what I think that book's all about. But yeah, like the what makes Armor Wars so interesting is the personal conflicts Tony has with all these people in his life. Like Macy Pearson, I mentioned her before, she starts becoming somewhat antagonistic in so far as she works for him. She works for Stark. And she's saying Iron Man is causing us a public relations nightmare. You need to do something about him. And he's like, oh, yeah, look, I'll deal with it. Don't worry about it. You shared with me the screen cap of her saying maybe we need to get Bill Cosby in here to sort this out, get some publicity. Which again, time does make fools of us all. There's also a lovely bit where he walks past one of his former buildings and it's been acquired by Trump, so Trump's name is all over his building, which brings us back to Adam McKay, because Adam McKay made sure to have a sequence in The Other Guys where a Trump tower gets completely demolished by the heroes in one scene. I really enjoyed Armor Wars because I thought it had all those elements of the character that, like Space Twinks, cites as important. It's about drama, it's about relationships, it's about a flawed person trying to maintain this double life. I think Tony's way of the women is somewhat ridiculous, but it's somewhat sweet and chaste, and at the same time he's a player. Like, it's a really odd, like he has a girl in every town kind of thing. Like that's something that keeps coming up, and I don't think we have that version of Tony anymore. Now he's a dedicated monogamist. He's with Pepper, and that's it. So no polyamory in this future of Tony Stark.
So one of the things that's interesting, right, is if these characters are, like Eve Ewing says, kind of mirrors in some ways, like mirrors of what virtue look like, and they might even be mirrors that allow us to imagine flawed heroes, something changes. It's not really hard to see what, but at the time of sort of the extremist comic, we're into the 2000s, and the anxiety that hero is there to master is the future, right? Like, don't worry, we have a test pilot for the future. We have that person who will go one step beyond the bleeding edge. That is what that hero becomes. And it's not really hard to see what happened between Y2K, 9/11, like all of the changes of the early 2000s, why the anxieties that Iron Man is meant to soothe have changed in the 21st century. And even that notion of sort of masculinity, even a pretty screwed up masculine hero, he's now he's a one-woman guy. Like it's Robert Downey Jr. and Gwyneth Paltrow. And, she even kind of saves him at the end of the third Iron Man, which is sort of maybe the best one because it really knocks him on his ass for most of the film. But she even saves the day. So it's interesting to think about what needed to change. Like, why did that character need to change? What anxieties is it meant to soothe? What hopes is it meant to sort of reinforce? There's still this Tom Cruise looking test pilot billionaire hero of the future who's going to get us through the changing landscape of the 21st century. I mean, that's what I hear in those early 2000 comics, at least.
Yeah, I don't know, man. I still think that we had a generation of writers who had brainworms from Tony Blair and Bill Clinton and thought a third way of politics was possible. I think that's what's happening there.
I can pinpoint the exact moment that I thought I may have to stop reading comics because of Emmet, it was quite a sentence to feel in my head, but I'm sure you've encountered other people in your life who've been pushed to that extreme. Tony Stark sort of kills this terrorist, and he kicks a headless corpse and says, "Damn you for making me do this." And it's just such a 2000 superhero comic. Like, look what you made me do. I had to kill you in a really bloody way. And really, my heart sank so deeply, it could have ended superhero comics for me, which may even be a good thing, let's be honest. But that was the sort of absolute nadir of this reading experience for me. And just the flip side of that, like I was thinking from that third Iron Man movie where Robert Downey Jr. isn't even in the suit very much, my favorite times with this character are when they take him out of the suit. So Dwayne McDuffie has Tony Stark in his underwear by the end. Like, his suit gets turned into a mineral by Chemistro, the baddie. So in the end, Rhodes with a gun and Stark in his underwear go running through this forest. Rhodes tries to flag down traffic, but no one will stop for this African-American guy.
Oh, Stark, it's amazing.
Stark steps out in his underwear and immediately gets them a ride.
A beautiful woman stops to let him in her car. Yeah.
But even the beautiful woman, that's only there to sweeten the medicine that McDuffie's giving us, right? Like, what McDuffie's really saying is even a white guy stepping out of the hedges in his underwear is going to be in a better position to flag down a car in America.
Yeah.
There's an equally good line in Deathlock where Misty Knight says to Deathlock, like, do you know how hard it is for a cyborg to get a taxi driver to stop in New York? Which is, it's clearly like not really about cyborgs trying to get taxi rides.
Yes.
But it reminded me of the greatest Iron Man fight of all time, which is in total contrast to Extremis, is Iron Man fights Mr. Sensitive from Ecstatics.
I was going to bring this up. When you brought up Tony in his underwear, that was the first thing I was going to bring up. Yes, Ecstatics. Peter Milligan.
Remind the listeners what happens. Yeah.
So, Ecstatics is Peter Milligan's ex-book from the early 2000s. Remind me, the artist, amazing artist, husband-wife team, just did that great David Bowie book. Mike and Laura Allred. So anyway, Mike Allred, Peter Milligan, they do their take on the X universe, mutants as celebrities, blah, blah, blah. We get to, and it's very much influenced by reality television, and members of the team keep getting killed off in each issue. There's some great storylines built around the fact that the characters know one of them's going to die soon, and it's almost like a ratings hit for the viewing public, and so there's no help from anyone else. There's this bloodthirsty interest in who's going to die first. So it's very funny, very bleak book. There is one storyline which is a redo of the Avengers Defenders War, where the two teams have to go off on a quest to find a series of quest items, a series of things that need to be assembled. And in this case, it's the Avengers versus Ecstatics. And Tony Stark's one-on-one battle is with Mr. Sensitive, or the Orphan, as I believe he's known. And they are in a monastery, I want to say, and they're looking for this bit of a brain that's in the monastery. They have to find this bit of a brain. And at one point, they were reduced to fighting in their underwear because Mr. Sensitive is hypersensitive to everything, and Tony Stark has a heart condition. So they have a near naked fight scene where they're both trying not to kill the other one, but
it's
defeat
sort of poking and slapping each
other.
other.
Yeah, it's like a really gentle.
But this is the thing of, almost when they make mock of this character, they're at their most bearable. Like I say, that third movie really just sort of keeps sort of knocking the character down and refusing to give him back these gifts and privilege. But it comes back to this idea, and you sort of said it in Ecstatics there, that they're sort of they're sort of tied into being in this reality TV show. It's really a question of whether you are at the mercy of sort of big business or whether you sort of protagonize it. So in Ecstatics, they're sort of both victims of celebrity culture and heroes of it. And they're quite relatable, even though they're often quite unlikable people. In Deathlock, it's very much a corporate employee who's forced into becoming this sort of living soldier machine. And then what he does with that when he tries to rebel. Maybe the other thing about Iron Man is it's still this fantasy that someone can sit in the driving seat of capital. And I feel like in some ways we're seeing that sort of really run down now. Like once you've brought in Robert Downey Jr., someone of that talent, someone with that history, and it's really re-energized that character and made people love him in a way that maybe is unprecedented. What else do you do with this guy has a fancy suit? You know, like, what is left to say with that character? And I'm sure there's a writer out there somewhere who has a really lively answer. But my sense was of diminishing returns. The more I read of these comics to get ready to talk with you, you know, at times it really sapped me of strength.
I would be interested in. So I've recently been reading a lot of Marshall Berman, and I was reading All That Is Solid Melts into Air, which is his famous discussion of modernity, let's say. Don't worry, folks, I'll keep this quick. But for this somewhat academic text, he actually opens with an analogy to Captain America. Like, that's in the opening chapter. He's talking about Captain America. But he's talking about Captain America versus the villain Faust. Dr. Faust, I think, he's this big, ginger, bearded chap. He's still in the Marvel comics. He pops up every now and then. Sorry, in the chapter, he introduces a discussion of Faust from this comic book analogy with Captain America. And he then spends 3 chapters talking about the Faust Goethe poem and lands on the final book of Faust and discusses how it's all about an industrialist. It's all about somebody defeating the natural world, controlling the natural world, who actually confounds Mephistopheles because all of a sudden he's now interested in a form of living which is extrasensory. It's extrasensual. Like the devils try to exhaust him with experience, and now he's actually interested in dominating the world with industry, with building cities, building factories, and I think that's a take on Tony Stark I'd be really interested in. This Faustian, not in the sense of selling your soul, which is how it's commonly understood to mean. Faustian in terms of what happens when you exhaust the natural world of its resources, of its own nature. What happens when you entirely? We're talking about the Anthropocene, basically. Like, that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in Tony Stark, Iron Man, stuck in the Anthropocene. What does that mean? And instead, because of the comic books, we're talking about superhero comics. I get it. You know, they're Cold War concepts still being dug out of mothballs and reintroduced by writers. But I feel as if that's the line, maybe. That would be an interesting approach. What do you do when you live in an entirely man-controlled world? How do you move on from? How does that develop? How does that continue? What does that mean for the future? That's the challenge that we are facing right now, where our own presence on this world has now become so damaging that we are setting in motion chaotic elements that we can't predict because they're not observable. The consequences of our actions are not predictable.
Well, one of the concepts that's used in this kind of strategic work is this notion of the feral future. So there are tame, wild, and feral futures. And the way it works is that a tame future, you kind of know how stuff's going to play out. Like, if I do X, I know that Y will happen. And then wild futures are where you know that this is unprecedented, it's turbulent, you know you're going into a situation where you have no model for how things are going to play out. The feral futures, which are really interesting when you're talking about a sort of technocratic hero as we are, feral futures are where you think things are tame, but then your actions actually make them wild. And once they've gone wild, you cannot then use the same methods to tame them again. So whether you think of examples like Chernobyl, like the Deepwater Horizon disaster, you have technological systems where we feel like we're in control, but actually because of lack of information, because we don't really understand what's going on, because of all those muddy gray areas of human greed or corruption, or just the ability of things to kind of go adrift from what we expected, things became feral in a way that you couldn't just put the lever into reverse. So I think one of the interesting things for a character who's largely defined by money, an association with the military, however ambivalent, and this notion of being at the bleeding edge of technology is what does that mean for a world where we see things becoming feral? We see that we can't solve problems alone. We can't solve problems purely with dollar bills and technology. I wonder what that means for turning that character into a meaningful mirror for notions of bravery, as Eve Ewing says, for notions of heroism, and who you put in that suit, who you put in that role.
Yeah, I'm reminded that when I was, I want to say 11 or 12, Knights of Pendragon was coming out, Dan Abnett, and their main claim for that was it was printed on recycled paper, and it was very much an ecological, supernatural superhero comic, and that was decades ago, and we still debate this as if it's something that we have time to debate, we have time to discuss, but like we're now entering into a period where it's less and less likely we have any opportunity to debate this. It seems as if we're driving into this future with the expectation that, well, some of us are going to die. And this, particularly during the plague year, this feels quite apt. Where we saw the result of nations in the world not cooperating, not sharing information, not allowing for trade or passage of humans in any sort of controlled way, and what resulted was contagion, and it's quite upsetting to be witness to this.
It makes me think of how, and certainly probably I'm just speaking from my own perspective here, but I really need to see a heroism that is about hope, that is about care, and that is also capable of being in some way insurgent, like rising up against the status quo. And maybe that's the limit of this character that we're talking about, is they're so fundamentally beginning from a position of privilege that they can never really be a character that overthrows the existing order. And I think one of the things that saddens me a little bit about the Marvel movies and TV shows is the extent to which those heroes are militarized, the extent to which they are a sort of post 9/11 story, the fact that everything comes back to S.H.I.E.L.D. in some way. Like at some point it feels like a Tom Clancy movie with superheroes sometimes. Certainly the Captain America Winter Soldier reminded me of a Tom Clancy movie. And I was watching the first Zorro film recently with Antonio Banderas, and it was just a nice reminder of like a character with a bit of elan puts on a funny costume and has a swashbuckling adventure and doesn't take themselves too seriously. And for me, I think that was the limit of reading all these sort of serious techno thriller, semi-po-faced comic books was actually, I can stand to see Iron Man fighting in his underpants in a monastery, and I found my way back into things where there was sort of hope, but not through this kind of like hard-nosed, high-altitude superhero as fighter jet kind of thriller.
Yeah, well, what I've taken from the research I did for this conversation was I need to read more Bob Layton. I think I need more Bob Layton in my life. His Hercules book I can also recommend, where it's Hercules in the far future and he's having adventures in space. It's great stuff. But like this Iron Man book he did, I really, with David Michelini, I really did love. I loved Doomquist as well. I thought that was a lot of fun. Folks out there, if you're listening, if you want to read some classic Iron Man stuff, Armor Wars, Doomquest, like you can actually see where the filmmakers took elements from these. There are moments from Armor Wars I recognize in Iron Man 3 and Iron Man 2. Like it's clearly one of the source texts for the movies. But yes, certainly there is a sense of the classic character is almost out of sight, I feel. And I wish I could have read the Kieran Gillen books on Iron Man, but unfortunately, I think it's Greg Land who's on the art, and I can't touch him. My eyes just go blurry when I see Greg Land's art. I also enjoyed cameos from, just to date the comic, and see cameos from Michael J. Fox, I think Warren Beatty, and Don Johnson in Armor Wars. So we're definitely in the 80s here. Never mind to mention the call out to Bill Cosby.
There's an amazing bit where Tony gets injured and he specifies that he's having a blood transfusion where the blood has been tested
AIDS
for
tested.
AIDS, which is like peak 80s, right?
Wow, that shocked me. That was incredible. But like it was what people were afraid of at the time.
So the real question is going to be, that was 30 years ago. 30 years from now, assuming these superheroes and these characters still endure in some form, and somebody might be sitting on a podcast or whatever follows it, looking back on where these characters are at now and the anxieties and the things that are being depicted. And what I'm curious about as well is those future people, however imaginary they are, what are they going to see that we've missed? Like when we're talking about these characters in this light, they're going to say, do you know what Matt and Emmet and the Deconstructing Comics people didn't see was coming is this. And that's really, for me, the essence of looking at the future is no one can gather data or evidence from events that haven't happened yet. Nobody has got the secret of future bottled somewhere, but we can ask ourselves, what's the stuff that lies just beyond the limits of what we think is plausible? Where can we stretch our sense of what the future might hold in a way that's useful to us? And I also think that's still what comics can do at their best, is just push us that one step beyond. And I suppose that's my hope for whatever that character holds. We talked a little bit before this call about the Netflix movie See You Yesterday, which is about two African-American high schoolers who build a time machine in their garage. And it reminded me very much of the Riri Williams Ironheart comic in some ways. But it was such a perfectly sort of like poignant, clear-eyed, funny, adventurous kind of sci-fi story of really imagining what it would be to be a teen genius adventurer who did not come, with all of life's privileges attached and bankrolled in the way that the Iron Man character is. I'm almost curious to see where that kind of storytelling goes and the kind of premises we see in that kind of movie. What would it mean for two teens from Bed-Stuy to have a time machine, and what's it like if we don't always return to the same protagonists? That's one of the things that's come alive for me in having this conversation with you and doing this reading with you.
Wonderful. Well, Dr. Matt, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you so much. If people are interested in learning more about you or reading about your work, where should we point them to?
There's a website called Mechanical Dolphin. So if you go to mechanicaldolphin.com, you'll find me there.
Wonderful stuff. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
You can help Deconstructing Comics and all our podcasts by joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/deconcomics. And go to deconstructingcomics.com to connect to us on Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube, to shop on Amazon to support the show, and to find links to subscribe to the podcast. Our theme is by J.B. Anderton. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and we'll critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read at least 30 pages of it and critique it on the show. Next week, Kumar and Emmet discuss Eleanor Davis's graphic novel, How to Be Happy. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.